G'day, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute and host of Follow the Money. And if you're anything like me, you are glued to coverage of the US presidential election unfolding at the moment. It's bonkers, and if you want to stay up to date on all the latest things that are happening in that presidential campaign and the election, then you should tune in to After America, the new podcast featuring Dr Emma Shortis from the Australia Institute's International and Security Affairs program. You can find it wherever you normally find your podcasts. Here's the first episode. I hope you enjoy it.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi there. Welcome to After America, a new podcast from the Australia Institute. I'm Dr Emma Shortis. I'm Senior Researcher in International and Security Affairs. Each week, together, we'll talk about the US presidential election. We'll be joined along the way by some fantastic guests to discuss what's happening in US politics and what that means for Australia and the rest of the world. We've got a particular treat for you this first episode. But before we get to that, I think it's worth reflecting on what has been an absolutely wild week, even by the standards of modern American politics.
After 14 years in exile, Julian Assange is 3.5 hours away from arriving back in Australia, a free man.
As Prime Minister, I have been very clear that regardless of what you think of his activities, Mr Assange's case had dragged on for far too long.
And Mr Assange, I have no doubt, will be a continuing force for freedom of speech. He is a powerful voice and a voice that cannot and should not be silenced.
This prosecution sets a dangerous precedent that should be of concern to journalists everywhere.
Of course, about a week ago now, news broke that Australian citizen Julian Assange had finally struck a plea deal with the United States Department of Justice. After nearly 14 years of confinement of one kind or another, including 5 years in a maximum security prison, Julian Assange was allowed to come home to Australia. Assange has since been described as an irritant in Australia's relationship with the United States. But I think it's really worth emphasising that Assange is so much more than an irritant in that relationship. In fact, he's critical to understanding Australia's alliance with the United States, to understanding how it functions, what its priorities are, and probably more importantly, given his freedom, what that relationship could be if those priorities were reconsidered. We will cover this case in more detail in the coming weeks because it is so central, I think, to that relationship. It got so much attention and continues to get so much attention because what Julian Assange and WikiLeaks did is highlight some pretty fundamental hypocrisies about the United States' role in the world. They spotlighted Australian understandings of the United States as our ally and as the guarantor of our safety, and fundamentally undermined American claims to being, as President Ronald Reagan once put it, a force for good in the world. Which brings us to the debate, the first of the 2024 presidential election cycle.
If it's a fair and legal and good election, absolutely. I would have much rather accepted these, but the fraud and everything else was ridiculous.
Making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID. With dealing with everything we have to do with. Look,
President Trump?
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either. This man is a criminal. This man, you're lucky. You're lucky. I did nothing wrong. We'd have a system that was rigged and disgusting. I did nothing wrong.
The idea that you have a right to seek retribution against any American just because you're president is wrong. It's simply wrong. No president's ever spoken like that before. No president in our history has spoken like that before.
As far as Russia and Ukraine, if we had a real president, the president that knew, that was respected by Putin, he would have never invaded Ukraine. A lot of people are dead right now, much more than people know. You know, they talk about numbers. You can double those numbers, maybe triple those numbers. He did nothing to stop it. In fact, I think he encouraged Russia from going in.
We're the most admired country in the world. We're the United States of America. There's nothing beyond our capacity. We have the finest military in the history of the world. No one thinks we're weak.
Like the rest of the debate, Joe Biden's claim that the United States is the most admired country in the history of the world wasn't fact-checked in real time. Not that I'm convinced that fact-checking would necessarily have helped the situation. While the criticism of the anchors and the debate structure is, of course, entirely legitimate, what might have ameliorated all that is a decent performance from Joe Biden, a performance that actively and quickly refuted Donald Trump's appalling and violent lies in real time. And what happened is that the incumbent president was unable to do that. It is pretty difficult to see how Joe Biden himself and how his campaign recovers from this. And I think that at some points in the debate, looking at his face and in the days since, you can kind of tell that he knows that if he is going to recover, he's going to have to do it very, very quickly. And that's not just because his own political career is at stake, but because, as he has put it, the very soul of America is at stake in this election. And that's why it was particularly striking that democracy, the January 6th insurrection, weren't in fact brought up in the debate until about half an hour in, once Joe Biden had already lost. What that did was make democracy just one issue on a long kind of laundry list of themes that the anchors rolled through. That's catastrophic for Joe Biden's ability to frame this election on his own terms, but it's also potentially catastrophic for the future of American democracy. And it was particularly remarkable and so very American, even in the middle of that bin fire, President Joe Biden still harkened back to this imagined version of America, an America that is revered across the globe, that shining light on the hill. That was always at least partly a myth. And whatever happens in November, that idea of America, Joe Biden's idea of America, the America that we thought we knew, is gone, and it just isn't coming back. For this inaugural episode of After America, I'm lucky enough to be in conversation with one of the most thoughtful analysts of the United States working today. Nick Bryant is former BBC foreign correspondent, where he covered Washington, New York, South Asia, and Australia. He is, in fact, a historian by training, so a man after my own heart, and he's the author of several books, including one that actually made its way into the Oval Office. He's here with us to discuss his latest book, The Forever War, America's Unending War with Itself. And I'll note that we recorded this conversation the day before that bin fire of a debate. Nick, thank you so much for being here.
Emma, it's an absolute pleasure and a special pleasure to be on this inaugural edition. I think there should be sort of red, white and blue bunting festooning our backdrops, but it's great to be here and good luck with the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's so exciting to have you here as the first guest. And I will say at the outset that I absolutely loved the book. In fact, I have to admit I was even a little bit surprised by how much I loved it, just because, you know, as a historian like you, I feel like I know much of the history that you cover in the book, but I found it really compelling. And also, of course, you know, confronting, I think, as any honest exploration of American history has to be. And there's so much in it. There's so much history in this book. So, of course, we can't cover it all today. And we'll get to Trump. We have to get to Trump. As you say in the book, he's inescapable. But I actually wanted to start somewhere else with a section that really stood out to me personally. Because you write in one chapter really humbly about living in the United States with your children, and the deeply personal and quite kind of intimate horror, I think, of having them do lockdown drills in their schools. And that's something I kind of encountered a little bit when I was in the States a few years ago as well, when I sort of realised late in the piece that where I was living was about 20 miles or so from Sandy Hook, and was there in the US with my 2-year-old at the time. And, I was finishing my PhD and thinking what I should do next and whether we should stay in the States. And that was kind of at the top of consideration, that I just couldn't, I didn't think I could live with the horror of my 3-year-old doing lockdown drills in a kindergarten. And when you write kind of after Joe Biden's inauguration that you wanted to get out, I really felt that, I think, quite deeply. And I think a lot of people who spend time in the United States, outsiders who spend time in the United States, feel that. But sitting alongside that, you write really beautifully about the pull of America, about our ideas about America. So you write, for example, that you were fixated by the Kennedys, which so many of us are and were, and about how thrilling it is to follow the road to the White House in election season. So that pull is real, and the ideas we have about America matter. So I wonder, after this very long introduction, if you can take us through whether it's possible or necessary to kind of try and reconcile those two very different versions of America. What we think it is, the majesty of so much of it, and then the everyday, almost kind of mundane violence of its history and its present. Is it possible to have, how can we have that many versions of America sitting alongside each other?
Well, let me explain my journey, Emma. It began as a very young kid looking up at this beautiful mosaic in the city where I was growing up in, Birmingham, in the West Midlands. And I was looking up at this mosaic of this handsome young man addressing a multi-ethnic crowd, stood in front of this gold blob that I couldn't quite make sense of. Anyway, that gold blob was the presidential seal. That multi-ethnic crowd included Martin Luther King. That handsome young man was John F. Kennedy. And even as a young kid, I was sort of transfixed by the Kennedys. I studied him at school. I studied him at university. I ended up doing my PhD about John F. Kennedy. My first book was about Kennedy. And initially, I really bought into the myth of Camelot, this myth that was created in the aftermath of his death. Camelot was never used during his life. It was the invention of his widow, Jackie Kennedy, in her first interview after his death with a chronicler of American history called Teddy White. And it was published in Life magazine, and it introduced into the lexicon this idea of a Kennedy Camelot. And the more I learned about Kennedy, the more I realized that my kind of idealized and romanticized view of Kennedy just didn't stand up to historical scrutiny. I'd always been led to believe, for instance, that Kennedy was the champion of the struggle for black equality, and he really wasn't. For Kennedy, civil rights was this issue to manage politically. It was a political irritation rather than a moral cause to champion. He had this difficult political situation at the time where the Democratic Party, as you know, was this weird amalgam of Southern racists and Northern progressives. And Kennedy, like all Democratic leaders, tried to straddle that divide. So I got a sense very early on of these deeply conflicting emotions about America. For many people, of course, and for me, initially, Kennedy personified the best of America. Its dynamism, its promise of immigrant success, its charisma, its glamour, its sense of modernity. But then I realized that Kennedy was also very cynical in his politics. And I constantly face this living in New York during the Trump years, as you say. We always said, me and my wife, my Australian wife, that we would leave the country as soon as the kids realized why they were doing those shooter drills. And weirdly, that the age that they realized they weren't being prepared to prepare for a hurricane, which is what they were told. They were being told to prepare for a hail of bullets. That kind of coincided with actually, Biden winning the presidential election and Trump being seen off the premises in 2020. And I'd loved America. I'm not one of these Europeans who has this sort of knee-jerk anti-American attitude. I'd absolutely adored America. But it was less emotionally complicated for us to leave than I thought it would, to be honest, because I just felt that the country I'd fallen in love with didn't really exist anymore.
Yeah, if it existed at all is the question that always sits with me. And I guess to continue with Kennedy, you write really beautifully about his assassination in particular and how it was taken and is still taken as, a kind of singular moment where the shining light was ripped away, which is, of course, the Camelot myth. And there's a continued pattern in the history of American politics of treating those events as singular events, treating January 6th or even Donald Trump himself as an aberration. But you argue quite clearly that that's not the case at all, that, Kennedy's assassination was, I think you describe it as less a departure than a continuation. So I wonder if you could take us through that, because the compulsion to see those moments as aberrations is still, even after January 6th, even after or in the midst of Trump, that compulsion is so strong.
Yeah, as a kid, I certainly subscribed to what I call the lone gunman theory of post-war American history, that before Kennedy, there was this great sort of optimism about American life. And after Kennedy, things went terribly awry. You get the Vietnam War, you get the race riots of the late 1960s, you get Watergate, you get the kind of conspiratorialism that we've seen. And the inflection point, the clear break, is the Kennedy assassination. But what I argue in the book is that America really wasn't that different on November the 21st, 1963, the day before Kennedy was assassinated, than it was the day after. Indeed, Kennedy was actually on his way to a place called the Dallas Trademark in his motorcade that day to warn against misinformation and conspiratorialism. On the eve of his assassination, Richard Hofstadter, who is one of the great thinkers about America, he delivered this incredibly bleak lecture at Oxford University, which became the basis for his famous seminal essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, which spoke of how American politics was coming to be dominated by conspiratorial fantasy and uncommonly angry minds, as he put it. If you look at the 1950s, well, you'd had the progress of the Brown decision, which ordered the slow desegregation of Southern schools, but it was met by massive resistance in the South. You had McCarthyism in the 1950s. Dallas was known as the city of hate long before Kennedy was assassinated, because it was a home to so many right-wing fanatics. Adlai Stevenson, who was UN ambassador, warned Kennedy against going to Dallas because he feared he would be attacked by these members of the John Birch Society, who on the morning of Kennedy's visit put up this advert in the newspapers that was a wanted poster, wanted for treason, it said, John F. Kennedy. And they believed he was a communist in the same way that Eisenhower had been a communist, and FDR had been a communist, and Harry Truman had been a communist. It was absolutely nuts. But that was the America pre-Kennedy's death, whereas we often think that's the America post-Kennedy's death. And it speaks of how you could pick virtually any date in American history and find the same poisonous brew that led to Kennedy's assassination. And what I argue was that poisonous brew was also evident on January the 6th, 2021.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always so struck by that, claim that enemies of conservatives are communists in particular. Trump will say that about Biden in almost every stump speech he does. And I always wonder what it would be like if they, encountered an actual communist, right, or an actual Marxist. But anyway, I think, to go back to that point about backlash against Kennedy, against even the suggestion or the perception that he might, be enacting some more civil rights reform, for example, that backlash again is one of the patterns, I suppose, that you identify in American history. I mean, as a historian, we probably shouldn't use the term patterns, but it is a recurring theme in American history. And again, you argue quite clearly in the book that white supremacy in particular is foundational. Of course, that's not a new argument. Historians have been making that argument for a long time, as have many others. But I suppose I'm really interested in the through line you draw from the foundation of the United States, and particularly the Constitution, which you describe at one point as a pro-slavery document, all the way through to President Obama in particular, who, you spend quite a bit of time on Obama and the backlash to him, but also I think adding nuance and complexity to how he himself navigated being the first Black president. All of which to say is that Trump kind of valorizes and plays into white supremacy, but again, it's not something he created.
Yeah, a recurring theme is how progress in race relations is so often followed by a backlash. The end of enslavement after the Civil War. I mean, first of all, you get Lincoln being shot within days of the Confederate surrender. Massive setback. You have this period of Reconstruction where blacks briefly enjoyed the benefits, the sunshine of emancipation. And that, of course, is followed by the era of Jim Crow, the segregation. Enslavement had been the price of national unity in the founding, and after the Civil War, segregation was the price of national unity. What we see in the mid-1960s is these dramatic reforms, these belated reforms, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which dismantled Jim Crow, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which brought about universal suffrage for the first time. Americans in the South, Black Americans in the South, could finally vote unhindered. These were reforms that LBJ pioneered after John F. Kennedy's death. But again, the Voting Rights Act, the ink had hardly dried before a new attack on democracy began, a new attempt to try and curb voting rights for minority groups. You think back to the night that John F. Kennedy finally and belatedly delivered a televised address saying that Americans should finally pass a civil rights bill that would dismantle segregation. That very night, a leading civil rights activist, Medgar Evers, was shot dead on the driveway of his home, and he was literally carrying a bunch of T-shirts saying Jim Crow must go. If you look at the I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King's extraordinary sermon in August 1963, this wonderful moment, this paean to nonviolence, within 2 weeks, members of the KKK had bombed that church in Birmingham, Alabama, and killed those 4 schoolgirls. And of course, the classic case of progress being followed by terrible regression is when finally you get an African-American occupying a White House that was built with the help of the enslaved. And he is followed into office by the untitled leader of the birther movement, Donald J. Trump, who denied the very legitimacy of a black presidency.
I mean, it's still so shocking, even all these years later. I suppose that leads me to a question about how Trump was covered and how he is covered now, because another moment that really stood out to me in your book was you write about the constant pressure, I suppose, in covering Trump and developing that kind of sense of balance or faux balance, really. You write about that in a really compelling way. But there's one particular line that you identify towards the end. I think it was in one of the presidential debates where Trump was asked about white supremacist militias and their apparent support for him, and he responded with that line, "Stand back and stand by."
You have repeatedly criticized the vice president for not specifically calling out Antifa and other left-wing extremist groups. But are you willing tonight to condemn white supremacists and militia groups and to say that they need to stand down and not add to the violence in a number of these cities, as we saw in Kenosha and as we've seen in Portland?
Sure,
are you
I'm
prepared
to
specifically
do it?
Well, go ahead, sir.
I would say almost everything I see is from the left wing, not from the right wing.
So what are you saying?
I'm willing to do anything. I want to see peace.
Then do it, sir.
Say it. Do it. Say it.
Do you want to call him? What do you want to call him? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
Who would
white
you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud
militia.
Boys, stand back and stand by. But I'll tell you what. Somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left, because this is not a right-wing problem. This is a left-wing. This is a left-wing problem.
White supremacists. Antifa's an idea.
And I have really vivid memories of, doing media, doing press about that, and being asked quite sincerely by journalists when I said that was a call out to white supremacist militias, and getting all this pushback, sincere pushback, to say, well, can we really say that that's what he meant? Are we really sure that Trump is kind of calling on support from white supremacist militias? And you have this line in that where you say so definitively, he knew what he was doing then. And so I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about your experience, working with the BBC and navigating how to cover this man.
Yeah, I mean, discussions about the language that we should use around Trump literally happen every day, every hour, sometimes just minutes before your piece was due to air. There would be quite animated debates about just one word. Impartiality does not mean you can't say strong things, so long as that is where the facts lead, and that you are scrupulously fair in which facts you decide to use. And you can be selective with your facts, and that does open you up to the danger of being partial. But with Trump, I always felt, we had to call him out. I mean, the day, for instance, when he told those 4 congresswomen of color to go back to where you came from, that was textbook racism. And I was unequivocal about that at the BBC, that we had to say this was racist. I mean, the BBC ended up with a kind of weird policy that day where some BBC outlets, they could all decide for themselves whether they called it racist or not, but I actually refused to appear on the outlets that didn't call it racist. So you had this kind of weird approach where bits of the BBC were calling it racist and other bits weren't, and it wasn't great. But there were other times when, we just had to be very clear. And I think we have to be very clear now. I mean, Trump is authoritarian. I mean, how much evidence do we need? I mean, Trump has a long history of racism going back to his business days in New York. I mean, how much history do we need in calling Trump a misogynist? What better evidence do we have than him boasting about sexually molesting women in the Access Hollywood tape? I mean, given what he did during his 4 years in office and how he tried to trample over the kind of norms of presidential power and the norms of American democracy, I mean, how much more evidence do we need? And after January the 6th, I mean, it just seems to be very clear cut. So I'm worried, Emma, to be honest, about how this election is being framed. It almost seems to be, a really dismal contest between a doddery 81-year-old and a crazy 78-year-old. What a terrible choice. And in some ways it is. But that's not the way this election should be framed. I mean, the way that this election should be framed by the mainstream media is there is a Democrat in this race. I mean, a small d Democrat, Joe Biden, who believes in democracy, and his opponent doesn't. And that is how we should be presenting it. This is a code red moment for American democracy. This is the most important election of my lifetime. I suggest this is probably the most important election of the last 150 years. And that's how it needs to be framed. And we need to be unafraid of calling that out. We need to avoid this ridiculous false equivalence that we sometimes get into. And we need to be very honest in how we describe Trump.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I couldn't agree more. And you used that term there, Nick, authoritarian. Trump is an authoritarian. And of course, I agree with you. But you also throughout the book use other interrelated terms like demagogue or even fascist. And so I'm wondering about the logic behind those terms, because I would argue that Trump absolutely is a fascist. If you look at the scholarship, he effectively ticks all the boxes. But the risk, I suppose, or I guess the argument against that is that characterizes or caricatures Trump in a particular way that makes people turn away or is a particularly European framing. So what do you think is at stake when we use or don't use terms like authoritarian or fascist when we're describing Trump?
It's interesting you raised Europe there, Emma, because if Trump was in Hungary, or if Trump was in Poland, or if Trump was in France, or if Trump was in Italy, we would describe him as far right. Now, that doesn't often happen in the mainstream coverage of Trump. He doesn't get called far right. I think we would call him neo-fascist as well, if he was in a European context. And again, that doesn't happen. I mean, the definition of fascism is ultranationalist, populist, racist, authoritarian, demagogic. All of those things apply to Donald Trump. And there was a kind of bit of a sliding scale of terminology. I mean, demagogic seemed to me quite an easy one to use because it was just so obvious that Trump was a demagogue. And I think there was a kind of acceptability around using that phraseology, demagogic. Authoritarian got you into sort of trickier territory. But I think by the end of his 4 years in office, and certainly after January the 6th, it just seemed to me incontrovertible that he displayed so many of these authoritarian tendencies. Fascistic, I think you could use, and fascist even. I think some of the problems came from sometimes people likened him to Hitler. And I think, there's that argument, if you raise Hitler, you kind of lost the argument already. So, I was always keen to avoid that sort of stuff. I also didn't often call him a liar because I think for Trump, he didn't know whether he was lying or not. I think Trump has this alternative reality. To call somebody a liar presumes you know their motivation and you can read into their mind. And I think Trump's mind often sort of didn't think that was lying at all. The kind of crazy boasts weren't lies to him; they were the truth to him. So I avoided phraseology like lying, but certainly I went as far as I thought we could. And that would be my advice to any young journalist working for a mainstream news organization. You don't want to report a kind of safe distance from the line. You want to be right on the line in your use of terminology, and you can use very, very strong terminology as long as it's backed up with the facts. And again, I make this sort of comparison between how we cover American politics and how we cover European politics. If Trump was taking part in the European parliamentary elections a couple of weeks ago, we wouldn't have had any hesitation in calling him far right, in calling him ultra-nationalist, in calling him authoritarian, in calling him neo-fascist. I think one of the big differences is, in Italy, we kind of look at the roots of fascism and we cast back to Mussolini. In Germany, we look at the roots of fascism with the AfD and we look back to Hitler. I think because we don't really understand American history as well as we should in many ways, we don't kind of excavate the American past, which shows there's that kind of tradition in America as well, which Trump taps into.
He absolutely does. And again, that's one of the enormous strengths of your book, I think, is that it identifies the particularly American nature of Trump's authoritarianism. It doesn't need to look to Europe necessarily to find an explanation for what he is. And there's a section of your book which deals particularly with Trump's ability to enact, I suppose, authoritarianism in America through your history of the executive branch. And you have this really striking line where you write that when it comes to authoritarianism in America, Trump walked through a half-open door.
Yeah, I mean, one of the overarching arguments of the book, as you know, Emma, is that I say that Trump is as much a product of American history as FDR, Abraham Lincoln, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan. It's just the history that we have tend to forget, the history that has been overlooked, the history that has been buried and deliberately concealed. But if you look at sort of presidential history, authoritarianism, again, is a pretty constant thread. It begins with John Adams in the second American president, literally banned the opposition, criminalized criticism of the presidency. Andrew Jackson, who Trump adores, he's kind of the demagogic authoritarian who Trump regards as his presidential soulmate. I mean, he rode roughshod over Congress. Even some of the heroes of the American story, Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. He trampled all over the First Amendment. The Emancipation Proclamation he knew was unconstitutional. That was a great thing that he did. It brought with it the promise of ending enslavement, but it was unconstitutional at the same time. FDR is an interesting case study because, again, he is regarded as this great liberal hero, one of the greatest presidents ever. But one of the big applause lines in his inaugural address was actually when he suggested that he might have to alter the balance of the Constitution and request wartime powers during peacetime. And the point is that got vigorously applauded that day because the Americans were willing to have that kind of strong executive. And of course, FDR also busted this norm set by George Washington. It wasn't a constitutional rule back then that you could only serve 2 terms in the White House. But the point is, Emma, he kept on getting re-elected. The American people endorsed his strong style of leadership. So that's why I say that, when it comes to authoritarianism with Trump, I mean, Americans have always liked a strongman president, and they tend to punish the weak and the frail. Presidents like Jimmy Carter in their minds. Presidents like George Herbert Walker Bush, and maybe a president like Joe Biden.
Yeah, which I suppose brings me, I'm sort of loath to bring it up, but it brings us very, very firmly into the present because we are recording this the day before the first presidential debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And you write, of course, about Joe Biden quite a bit. And there's this really incredible line where you're writing about Biden's inauguration and I think maybe a sort of cardboard cutout of Biden. And you write that his taut complexion made it look like he had already been embalmed. Now, you've been really careful about, not framing this as like an old guy versus an authoritarian or, that it's not that simple. But that line embalmed, I think, is so critical because it sort of gets at, Joe Biden's politics as well and how they, perhaps might belong to a different era. there's such a lot of pressure and expectation on this debate, given that context and given what you've outlined in terms of what's actually at stake in this election. How much do you think the debate matters?
I think it could be huge. Let me tell you about that Biden cardboard cutout, first of all. It was in the lobby of my hotel on the morning of his inauguration, and it's him stood next to Kamala Harris. And Biden looks like a chirpy 60-year-old. He looks like he's selling condos in Florida. I mean, he just has this sort of brilliant smile. He looks like a much younger man. And it's a nod, really, towards how American inaugurations have always been seen as this kind of moment of national renewal. But that inauguration, of course, was very, very different. Outside of my hotel room, Washington was like a garrison town. I mean, I was staying a couple of blocks away from the White House, and there were combat troops everywhere. There was a green zone in Washington. That terminology, of course, had last been used in the Iraq War. And Washington literally felt like Baghdad on the Potomac that day. There were 25,000 troops there. That was 10 times the number that were in Afghanistan at the time. And they were there to stop American from fighting American. And it was just hugely depressing. And we went up to Capitol Hill, and we were stood on the inaugural stand, which, arguably should have still been sequestered by yellow police tape. It was a crime scene. I mean, it was the staging post, obviously, for the January the 6th rebellion, insurrection. And Biden delivers this inaugural address where he utters the word democracy has prevailed. But it wasn't uttered out of any great sense of celebration. It was uttered out of a sense of profound relief. And, the outcome of this presidential debate, I think, will have a huge impact on whether democracy can still prevail. I mean, we can talk about the history of televised debates, and it'll have happened by the time this actually comes to air, so we'll know what we can think. But the first one between Kennedy and Nixon was hugely important. Nixon thought he was cruising to victory. Nixon thought he was absolutely brilliant on TV. He could actually destroy Kennedy, and of course quite the opposite happened, and it really changed the dynamic of that race. In 1984, when Reagan took on Walter Mondale, Walter Mondale thought the moment he lost that campaign was that great gag from Reagan about the age issue. I won't take advantage of the youth and inexperience of my rivals. So, these debates historically can be absolutely transformative and pivotal. It's also worth remembering, though, Emma, that a lot of them are about last as long in the memory as a kind of one-day cricket international. I mean, how many moments, for instance, can we remember from the Mitt Romney, Barack Obama debates, binders full of women, that gaffe.
The fly.
Yeah, I mean, but, I think we really hype these things up, but all it takes is one moment, one freeze, one gaffe, one big mistake, and it can turn an election. So that's why they're still so important.
They are, and I think we'll all be watching with bated breath tomorrow, at the time of recording. Nick, I guess that leads me to one final question for you, which may be a difficult one to answer. I think you've been so clear about what is at stake this year in November, even alongside all that you've written about the troubled history of American democracy and, whether we can even call the United States a democracy before about the 1960s. That's not to minimise the stakes of this election, which, as you argued earlier, is likely the most important in the last 150 years at least. And you've outlined, I think, what's at stake in the United States itself. But I wonder if you might reflect on what's also at stake for the rest of the world. We're here in Australia where we, are incredibly closely aligned with the United States, one of the United States' closest allies. And so we have a lot at stake here, but so does the rest of the world. So I wonder, as a foreign correspondent, I think you're probably better placed than many people to reflect on that.
Well, I think democracy is on the ballot, as Biden says it is in this election in November. And globally, I think freedom is on the ballot as well. It's frightening to think of how Vladimir Putin would interpret a Trump victory. As a green light to advance on Kyiv? Maybe. And if that happens, how would China interpret a Trump victory? An invitation, maybe, or a kind of a message that it too could take Taiwan. And then you wonder, what are the regional and global ramifications of that for a country like Australia? You wonder what's going to happen to the AUKUS agreement. I mean, it's a very good agreement for America in many ways, because Australia is paying so much money for those nuclear submarines. But, one of the things that we know from Trump's first administration is any deal that wasn't negotiated by Trump is almost by definition a bad deal. We also know from Trump's first administration that actually the best way to deal with him as a foreign leader is as Malcolm Turnbull did, which is to stand up to him. Remember, he tried to rip up the deal that the Obama administration had done with the Turnbull government over the transfer of asylum seekers from Manus Island and Nauru to America. And he rightly, Turnbull stood up to Trump and said, well, if you rip up that agreement, Mr. President, nobody's ever going to do an agreement with America again. It's the unpredictability of Trump, I think, that makes things so worrying. Biden believes very strongly in the alliance system that's been the bedrock, really, of American preeminence and security since World War II. Trump does not believe in that. Indeed, it seems that often it's the closest allies that get the most humiliating treatment. As a Brit, I saw that, the way that he treated Theresa May. He used to speak openly about Boris Johnson taking over from her as Prime Minister, even as he was in Britain, being hosted by her at Blenheim Palace. I mean, it was just that crazy. And I wonder how he'll get on with Anthony Albanese, especially given Albanese's close relationship with Biden. I don't think Albanese is Trump's kind of guy, for all sorts of reasons. So, if there was a Trump victory, it would be a perilous moment for American democracy, and I think it would be a perilous moment for freedom around the world.
Oh dear. I might just indulge myself and ask a follow-up question, because this is something I think about a lot. In Australia, I think there is quite a fixation on AUKUS in particular and its place in the alliance, and what might happen to AUKUS if Trump is elected, exactly as you outlined. Do you think there's potential, given what you've said about democracy and freedom being at stake, do you think there's potential for a shift in the conversation in Australia around the alliance and foreign policy that might recognise that more foundational history that you are talking about there, in terms of our shared democratic values and bigger questions about that relationship than, the specifics of the submarine deal?
Well, at the heart of an alliance is the sense of shared values. And if Trump is in the White House, you don't have that sense of shared values. And I dearly hope that Australia will continue to adhere to those values. What worries me, Emma, is a kind of creeping Americanization of the politics here. When I got out of America with my family, I mean, that's sort of putting it strongly to say I got out of America as far to escape, but it did feel like a little bit like that. I remember being in our lockdown hotel. It was in the midst of COVID, and there was a roar of the crowd from downstairs. We were staying in a hotel in the Sydney CBD, and it was anti-lockdown protesters. And later on, I watched the news, and of course, I saw the pictures, and they were carrying Trump banners. And of course, the Australian lockdowns have become this kind of cause célèbre for the American hard and far right. You had some TV anchors calling for the invasion of Australia so that the people could be liberated. Tucker Carlson bemoaned the fact that there were such strict gun laws in Australia so that Australians couldn't take up arms against their own country. Ron DeSantis was suggesting an end of diplomatic ties. Ted Cruz was bemoaning the fact that Australia was cutting down on civil liberties because he'd always regarded Australia as the Texas of the Pacific. And I remember Donald Trump Jr. at the time putting out this tweet saying, "Don't Australia my America." And I remember thinking at the time, the polar opposite, "Don't America my Australia." I'm worried about the Trump effect, not just in foreign affairs, but in domestic politics as well. There's a worrying lurch to the hard and far right in European countries. There's a worrying lurch in America towards the hard and far right. And, I worry about the consequences in other countries too. if Trump does win in November.
I think you are not alone, Nick, in being extremely worried about the future. It is somewhat of a grim note to end on, but this is the situation we find ourselves in. Nick Bryant, thank you so much for joining us on this very first episode of After America.
Emma, I hope there is never an After America.
Me too, Nick. Thank you. That's it for our very first episode of After America. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed today's episode, it'd mean the world to us if you subscribed to the show and shared it with your friends. You can also reach out to us on social media at the Oz Institute, that's with an AUS, or you can email us at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. Our theme music is from Blue Dot Sessions. We'll be back next Tuesday. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks again for listening.